Hi, I'm Dan Sweet with HAI, Helicopter Association International, and welcome to today's webinar, Dispelling Misconceptions about the Drone Industry. We are really glad you joined us today. It's an interesting topic. One of the great things about working for HAI is I get to talk with some really fascinating people around the industry. And talking with Jonathan Daniels, Jonathan Rupprecht, about this issue has always just been really, really intriguing for me. So we're going to give everybody just a second to get joined in, and I'm going to run a poll here as soon as I find where my button is that allows me to do that. Here we go. We want to find out what everybody's role is in the drone industry. What brought you to this webinar today? So if you don't mind responding, we want to be able to know a little bit about more what you're doing. So we do ask that you just make one choice as well. So. Okay, so it looks like it's a bit of a mix. People are operating drones already within businesses. People are thinking about adding drones to an existing rotorcraft fleet, perhaps. Doesn't look like we have anybody who manufactures drones right now. And some of you are private pilots, so no, we certainly appreciate having you here. I need to find out where my other screen went to. There we go. Okay, I'm going to close the poll now. I think we have an idea who we're talking with. We appreciate that. I think that should be showing the results to everybody if you missed out. And there we go. So today, our speakers, let me get into who we're going to be having join us. First of all, Jonathan Daniels is the CEO of Praxis Aerospace Concepts International Incorporated, a service-disabled, veteran-owned small business headquartered in Searchlight, Nevada. His company provides practical solutions for multimodal ground, sea, and air industry response robot systems and infrastructure. And Jonathan is also the special advisor for emerging technology to HAI's board of directors. We also have today joining us Jonathan Rupprecht. Jonathan is an aviation attorney and the owner of Rupprecht Law in Jupiter, Florida. He's a commercial multi-engine airplane flight pilot with flight instructor and instructor ratings. He has been instrumental in striking down anti-drone laws and helping clients obtain hundreds of waivers. I understand it's almost 300 waivers total now. Airspace authorizations, exemptions, and operating certificates. So we have a couple of really great panelists today. If this is your first time joining our webinar, we'd like to make them interactive. We want you to get the information you need out of this webinar. So please feel free to ask questions. What we're going to do is we're going to hold all the questions that come in until the end of the webinar. And then we'll get to them between Jonathan and Jonathan. We'll answer all the questions we can with the time we have. Please use the question and answer module. We know that there's a chat feature. You guys are welcome to use the chat feature to talk amongst yourselves. I try to look at that and pay attention to it, but I just can't keep that and some other things going on at the same time. We do pay attention to the question and answer module, obviously. So please put your questions in there. This webinar is being recorded. And so what we will do is probably sometime tomorrow is get this posted back to our YouTube channel and to our website, rotor.org/webinars. And you can go back if you missed something or if you want to share this, we encourage you to do so. So let me stop sharing now. And I'd like to invite Jonathan to join me on screen. And we're going to bring up some slides here in just a minute. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us this afternoon. I think this is going to be an interesting discussion.
Oh, definitely. Thank you, Dan, for having us here.
Thank you.
I'm going to bow out for just a second while I get your slides set up. And so I'll let you discuss what we're going to talk about today, and then I'll let you know when your slides are ready to go.
Got it. Well, thank you very much. So this is pretty easy. Um, Very informal topic and discussion, allowing the two of us to kind of talk through some of the items and issues that we've discussed in the past, as well as common things that have been that we've observed with our clients, and we have some shared clients, and of course there's clients throughout the industry. I think it's really important is there's definitely a trend building as far as what misinformation is out there and things have just kind of grown legs. And I'm really happy that Jonathan agreed to meet with us on this and discuss as well. For a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that we do sometimes have counterpoints, which is very useful, but it does make sure we cover everything from a couple of different varieties because there are some common truths that are there. Dan really, I think, gave the great introduction to me. I did always want to throw out there because it's HAI. I'm a former Army helicopter pilot. That's one of those great things that taking that crossover coming out and being able to work in vertical lift industry has just been phenomenal. It does give a very different perspective, and I use that as our running joke. Helicopter pilots see one thing, airplane pilots see something different, and that frames a lot of our view. And you can't have too many of one on either side of the discussion because then you get a very big bias. So again, very happy with this one in this meet. Jonathan, you want anything to add?
Not really.
I know we're ready to jump into it.
Oh yeah.
So the slide pulling up and just walking through. Really, this is going to be about half hour or so of discussion questions, some predetermined items we have, followed by a Q&A, and then the closing remarks and just highlighting some of the stuff we talked about. And I love this picture. This is my favorite one. I have to include in almost every briefing. Just to set out some basic ground rules and ideas. Drones aren't as new as a lot of people think, right? We talk about emerging technology and the way we're doing it is different, but the fact that drones are in play isn't. Almost 100 years ago, there was airmail delivery using unmanned aircraft. And of course, this is the most famous drone mechanic in the world. Marilyn Monroe was discovered in the Denny drone factory in California, where they put out 48,000 drones a year. And that discovery picture was her actually working on assembling Denny drones, which is something that most people don't realize. And we're talking that's, almost 80 years ago. So these things are in play. And the fact that we had that much production 80 years ago, we've gone cyclic, but drones really aren't new. So we keep running into the same issues on a cyclic basis. And with that being said, I think we can go ahead and start the first discussion. So I think we're jumping in on the registration numbers first.
Sorry, Jonathan, I didn't know if you guys wanted to show that. I can stop sharing for right now. Let me know when you want to bring this up.
Yeah, if you don't mind, that's just really, so just jumping in on responsible person. So, right, it's all good, right? Technology is wonderful. So jumping in on responsible person, and, I want to talk about what the term responsible person means in the context of drone operations. John.
Sure. Yeah. So if you look in the regulations, 107 and the general portion of Part 91 do not specifically define responsible person. However, the FAA has defined responsible person. If you look in some of their documents regarding like Part 107 waivers, they do define it, and it's the person responsible for the safe conduct of the operation and for the strict observance of the terms and provisions contained in the waiver. It's that person is responsible for ensuring the remote pilot and command, the manipulators of the controls, and the visual observer, if one is used, right, that they are informed and observe the terms and provisions of the waiver. They have strict observance of the terms and provisions within, and they are familiar with the regulations codified in Part 107. Also, the responsible person should be a person who has ongoing knowledge of the operations of the small UAS under that waiver. That individual is not required to be a holder of a remote pilot certificate with a small unmanned aircraft rating, and they may be a representative of an organization. It says may there, it doesn't say must, which is interesting. And that person is responsible for maintaining information such as the list of pilots, make and model of aircraft, and that they must be able to give that over to law enforcement upon request or FAA. And that person is responsible for maintaining records or other information required to demonstrate compliance with special provisions of the waiver.
Right. So it's a great example of where that, some misconceptions that can come out of it. As you pointed out, responsible person isn't covered in the regulation and the rule for small UAS. And that as such, you know, is you have to go dig for it. You have to dig for what the answer is. And that leads people down to certain interpretations and guesses. So one of the questions always seems to pop up, right? Is the responsible person, you know, always the drone pilot themselves? And how do corporations and organizations handle that? Because as we've discussed, organizations aren't really covered by Part 107, right? It's this strange piece. So whenever you're dealing with anything regulatory, and I'm really happily not the attorney here, again, the other Jonathan is, but whenever you start having nebulous written and areas that they're not covered in regulation, that's where things start to get a little wonky. So what do you think about that aspect of it?
Yeah, so you see responsible person typically pop up with these special types of provisions. So like with waivers and authorizations, they'll have somebody there that kind of doubles as like a point of contact. They want to have a phone number so they can call the FAA, that is, and kind of figure out what's going on or stop the operation, as well as get the documents that they might need to do an audit on that individual. But then there's this other aspect of where they have to be kind of responsible for the training, the pilots that are informed of Part 107. So there's kind of an aspect there where you're almost kind of like a chief instructor, chief supervisor, where you don't have to maybe know it all, but are you able to maybe like outsource it to somebody who, you know, knows it? Because you're not required to have your 107 remote pilot certificate, but are you at least kind of managing it? And then there's another aspect there, because with small drone operations, like the pilot and the responsible person, they're all the same, right? It's only one guy. But when you start growing it, the next question becomes like, who's going to actually be the responsible person, right? Is it going to be kind of like the equivalent of a sergeant or lieutenant or the colonel? And you might have to have that conversation internally where the colonel's like, I want it on my resume, blah, blah, blah. But in reality, they don't know the day-to-day operations of what's going on. But the sergeant, you know, he's dealing with the garbage every day, but the colonel's like, you know, in a desk somewhere. So.
I love it, right? Because that's what we're talking about. So responsible person, as you said, you know, that's covered in other areas of the regulations when it deals with the air operator certificates and, you know, 135s, 121s. They have a better understanding. It's a commonly assumed practice. But normally, and I think you started to hint at it, you know, your responsible person has another title, right? So your responsible person might be the chief pilot who's responsible for training and oversight of the pilots, or the head of maintenance or director of maintenance and responsible for maintenance aspects. So you have this infrastructure of regulation, policy, and practices that we can lean on. And again, we don't really have that under 107 in the drone line. So how does that lead to people's misinterpretations and other misapplications? What are some potential shortfalls and pitfalls that you can run into?
What I've seen the most common is the responsible person doesn't actually know what's really going on with the day-to-day operations. Right. That's actually been the biggest problem, right? The colonel guy wants it. Sometimes the guy wants it to be like, I'm the guy that's in charge because I want to use that to try to get a higher promotion in the company, blah, 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 like that. But in reality, they don't really know what's going on day to day. They just kind of want to be a responsible person in title only. That's been actually one of the biggest problems, because you kind of ask the question like, hey, what's going on? And they're like, I don't know. And not good.
That's a really great point. I mean, you keep talking colonels and lieutenants, and that's public aircraft operations, but especially under public aircraft operations, the way some of them are contracted out, you know, that level of operation control, really your responsible person is the person who is executing and the chain for operational control of the entity. So that, you know, especially if you're doing PAO, you know, if you're a county fire department and the appropriate person to county hasn't authorized those things, then your responsible person really isn't the responsible person, right? They don't understand necessarily the not the liability, but the authority that they're trying to gain by being a responsible person and versus what they're authorized.
So the aspect of like operational control in a 107 waiver type of environment is interesting, because they take it from like 135 and they take it and they kind of push it over into 107 world. But then you kind of ask the question, but how much real operational authority is really there from a regulatory standpoint? I mean, at the end of the day, operational control is a safety issue, because you don't want to like let stuff slip through the cracks, right? So there's kind of an aspect here of like good business practice is really understanding these concepts, even if they're not regulatorily required. You still should do them. Like otherwise, you're stupid. Like you don't want stuff to fall through the cracks and be crashes. Why would you want that? Even if you're not regulatorily required. So when it comes to doing certain types of operations, I mean, from a responsible party standpoint, you get the obvious things you definitely cannot do, like lying, falsifying documents and stuff like that. Yeah, you want to get some felonies and get really in trouble, definitely do that. But outside of that, there's not really too many things that they tell you exactly maybe to specifically do, or maybe have some liability against that individual directly. But what's going to happen is if you don't do that, the FAA is going to get really upset and start pulling your exemption or waiver authorization. Therefore, the operation is grounded, right? So maybe if the chief supervisor doesn't behave, right, the 137 op potentially gets shut down or suspended, right? And now you have some serious problems, at which point that guy is going to care about what's going on, right? So
Right.
that individual will have, there will be some way the FAA can get at that guy to make sure he does behave, or at least the corporation will behave.
Right. I mean, it sounds like that really tags in the aspect of accountability and liability, right? So if you're a responsible person, if someone's flying under a waiver and exemption, and the responsible person isn't aware and didn't necessarily authorize the flight, and that you don't have that documentation, I mean, that could truly impact liability, accountability for an accident or some kind of misuse if something's done inappropriately or violates the waiver, right?
Well, I mean, like what I do with a lot of my clients, right? If it's not written down, it didn't happen. So you should document it, the daylights out of it, right? Have some, like a sheet of paper on the back end saying, hey, I've been informed of my, duties under, the waiver, blah, 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 right? Have each of the remote pilots, the persons manipulating the controls, the VOs, all have, like, you reviewed it with them. So kind of think about it from like a training standpoint. You've done that and gone through some type of training with them or something. They've at least advised them, and then you have a signature saying somewhere that they've been advised of that. It's definitely going to create a paper trail in the event that something does happen. So potentially, maybe from a corporate standpoint, you could try to isolate it and say it's not a defect maybe on our some of our stuff. I mean, ultimately, as an employee of that company, you're going to be held liable. But there might be an opportunity there where you could say, hey, that individual was acting completely criminally rogue. We didn't know anything about it. You could try to maybe isolate some of the blame. It's you're still going to be on the hook. It's just, whether you have a slightly more defensible position than is if you didn't keep any records.
Right. So I guess maybe the easy answer to wrap up responsible person is to prevent the misconceptions and prevent, your own exposure to liability and risk, is to make sure you have documentation and a good solid set of procedures in place for what that responsible person is, because you don't have the regulations and policies and advisory circulars to fall back on. So again, if you agree with that, then we can jump into the next really great big one that I know we want to get into.
Yeah, I agree. The responsible party, ultimately, if you look at each waiver, exemption, authorization that has a responsible party, look at the actual terms and conditions, because it'll explicitly say what they got to do. So you can literally take all that, copy paste it over, and that becomes what they're responsible for like, jobs. It's pretty simple.
Right. So there was a great Audi commercial maybe 5-6 years ago where they basically recreated the Hitchcock film The Birds using multicopters and drowned out the skies and blackened the skies with drones. And that kind of plays into a lot of fear, right? There's this idea that we're going to have millions and millions of drones that are blackening out the sky and flying all over. And everywhere you go, everything you do, there's everyone on the street having their own drone delivery kind of thing. So I guess reality is that we talk about these millions and millions of drones, but what is the truth? I mean, how many drones are actually registered, and what does that number really look like?
Right. As of today, the latest information I could find was there were a total of 863,000 total drones. 352,000 of them are registered as non-recreational. So that's typically what we would call commercial. And 506,000 are registered as recreational.
So how does that compare to the traditional manned aircraft, right? That sounds like almost 150%, right? There's something like 200,000, general aviation aircraft registered. Do you have a number for that as well?
No, I didn't pull those numbers yet, but there is a graph we're going to use later on that is going to be very interesting. We can talk about, and how some of the numbers have been hyped.
Oh, well, Dan, I think that's your cue.
I was waiting for the subtle hint.
Right.
Right. So if you look at this picture here, you're going to see that really early on, for the first year or two, we didn't really understand how many registrations were going to kind of happen. And there was an initial pop there of registrations. The FAA as well as the news media did a good job at kind of really communicating. And so the registrations were happening. But what happens after, right, 3 years, we're going to have the registrations are going to start falling off. Well, what ended up happening was originally the FAA was publishing cumulative, which was showing the total fleet numbers. But after you hit 3 years, what happens is the cumulative numbers, which is what the FAA was publishing, aren't really the exact thing as the actual current fleet numbers. So what happened is it kept on going. Then the FAA published a NPRM for remote identification. We could talk more about that later, but they published that. They used those really, really big numbers to kind of justify these drones are, it's growing, it's going to be coming into backyard near you. And then you'll notice, and just looking at that picture, can you guys take a guess when the final rule of the NPRM came? I mean, the final rule came out for remote ID. It came out, right, just a little bit before that massive drop. So what ended up happening is the FAA waited until they had the final rule, and then they started basically reporting the numbers as current fleet numbers. And that's why you see this massive drop of registrations to the real kind of current fleet numbers. So kind of going forward there from January of 2021, you start seeing that's what's going on. And you don't really see this spike going on. You just see this kind of almost flatlining. It's been about 2 years for about the same number of total drones. And if you look, you can see the red line is the recreational drones. You can see it kind of peaks up a little bit, and then it kind of goes down a little bit. And then the non-recreational drones, what we typically consider like the commercial operators, right? It kept descending there for a while, and then it kind of went back up. So interesting about that. And FAA's never really aggregated all this data together and published it, because really what happens is when you start getting into all this data, you start realizing that the FAA's numbers from the remote ID and everything were massively off. And with this 50% drop here, there's some interesting aspects about this that you may want to take going forward. If 50% of the total population pretty much disappears, and then the total static number, right, the number of mid-air collisions or near mid-air collisions is static, like I'm not going to argue about like what was classified as what's reliable or not. Let's say that number is static, the total population shrinks. That in reality means the mid-air collision risk of drones is actually in reality about 2x higher. And so inaccurate numbers produce inaccurate results, which could potentially have inaccurate risk assessments from the FAA as they integrate more drones into the sky. But in reality, you're kind of seeing a flatlining going on here from this data.
Well, now this is Part 48 data. So what about, I mean, equivalent Part 47 data, which is the over 55 pounds. I realize there's probably not 200,000 over 55 pound drones that are registered. But what do you have any idea what that number? Because I've heard that brought up before. Is that, oh, that's Part 48, Part 47 is different, and it is, but I don't see it being that drastically different.
So yeah, there's a couple interesting like caveats to this data, just to throw out there. One, I emailed the FAA asking more about the data, asking like, hey, do you guys like segregate? Do you have any way to clean the data for like double counts? So right, if somebody sells me a drone and I register it, did you somehow clean the data for a double count? The FAA said no. So these numbers are actually overestimated numbers, just first of all. From that's an interesting data point. In the data that I have from the Part 48 registration database that I went in and looked at, there were numerous aircraft that I found that were aircraft that would never be able to operate under Part 48 because they were empty weight over 55 pounds. Like DJI T-30, T-40 Agrises for spray drones, they're never getting under 55. So what happened there is there's a lot of people that don't really know what they're doing, and the resellers aren't really communicating to them. So they're registering under Part 47 because it's a lot easier than doing a Part 47 in number registration. If you want to see the total number, yeah,
a Part 48 registration.
Yeah, that's what I mean. They would rather do a Part 48 online method rather than the Part 47 way of doing it right now, which yes, I do understand. They have transitioned to doing online method with CARES and stuff, with the Part 47s and stuff like that. Right. But primarily with a lot of this registrations have been happening, it was everybody was doing Part 48 registrations. And if you want to see the true, I guess, well, what is registered under Part 47, if you can see there's like a really, really small little orange line at the bottom, that's like, I don't even see it. Yeah, that's the Part 47 registrations that
Right.
like
And
so.
and
Which
to
is
be clear, to make sure we're talking about the same thing. You're talking about the little tiny orange line looks like a highlight on the x-axis.
yeah,
Got it.
that's
Right.
the
So
55.
we're talking a pretty small amount. Well, I
But
mean, this is go ahead.
but going back to the point, there's a lot of people that were ignorant about the 47 part versus 48 distinction there, and they were just going on and registering under Part 48, the online method. So there is going to be some amount in the Part 48 that the kind of that yellow line above that really in reality should be down below. So that's an underestimated number. I'm just throwing that out, while the yellow one is going to be an overestimated number due to that distinction.
Got it. So knowing that registration is really what drove a lot of the public safety aspects of remote ID, and this is something we're going to talk about when we talk about the ADSB aspect. But these numbers, when you start to look at the economic impact of rulemaking, these numbers are very important, because if it's $1,000 for 800,000 drones to comply with, that is a lot more and a much greater effort than $1,000 for 200,000 traditional aircraft. And it does definitely skew some of the answers. So I'm definitely going to talk more about that for ADSB.
Right. Yeah, because your regulatory burdens, if it drops by 50%, then your regulatory compliance is going to, in essence, be potentially 2x higher, just because it's fewer people to spread across from. So that
Right.
This creates all sorts of perverted numbers everywhere, because the FAA was inaccurate, what I would argue from an intentional standpoint, on the front end.
Right. So we're not going to go there. So what do you think the implications of this for air traffic management, public safety, and as they're chasing down, counter UAS is a big issue, remote ID receivers is a big issue. I mean, what kind of impact does this inaccurate registration number have? I mean, that's a misconception that is driving forward on regulatory aspect or public safety aspect.
Right. Yeah, there is an aspect well, okay, first of all, this is only the total population of drones that have been registered, not the total number of drones sold. So there is an aspect there where law enforcement could say, well, the bad guy's not going to register or something, and we need some counter UAS. So this is kind of, if you will, population count of those attempting to try to be lawful. And then we'd have to make estimates to try to figure out the total population of drones. But if you're looking at this, just saying, hey, I'm guessing the total population is going to be similar to total number of registrations happening, then you can make that assumption and say that the total population isn't really growing, and there isn't this kind of like in certain areas maybe a progression, and kind of what we have right now over the last 2 years is maybe our baseline, and it might be slowly climbing thereafter. I mean, but there are some legitimate counter UAS things. I'm not trying to downplay it. I mean, there are lots of drug drop related issues going on at prisons that have been going on for years. So that's actually, and anything running drugs and weapons across borders, that's very legitimate as well. So but that all kind of needs to be pointed out.
Got it. So one of the other misconceptions then would have to be that these numbers are all the drones that exist, right? It's not like traditional aircraft that are registered as point of sale and they're transferred registrations and any of that. These are there's a large amount that are imported, manufactured of drones, especially sub-55, that don't get registered by any means. So I'm gonna take this and jump with this because one, keeping us on time, and two, because segment 3 is my piece about ADSB and the outputs overloading air traffic control. One of the things we talk about again, and I remember this back in 2007. When we first pushed the idea that the DoD would have 1.1 million hours a year of flying small UAS, and everybody thought that was insane. Just looking at the numbers you have, that's basically every one of those registered drones flying for 2 hours a year period to get to that number. So, we at the time very much underestimated how many of those would be. But that drove a lot of the decisions, because also back then we talked about ADSB being a detect and avoid solution, and that very quickly came out of favor, because the idea was that ADSB would get saturated and overloaded and wipe out all of air traffic control. So that if you looked at a scope and you think about scope, you just have this big giant white spot on your scope from all the drones that were flying and blackening out the sky. So
can I interrupt real quick? Can I pull your slide down now?
Oh yeah, sorry, go ahead. Nope, go ahead.
I just didn't see you guys talking.
No, it's all good, Dan. I get carried away and just start going. So when we talk to ADSB, right, and what we used to call robust ADSB, that was the detect and avoid function. These outputs are really a couple of different things, and now the conversation, especially with Part 89, which is the remote ID rule, and the changes they made, the 91225, which is ADSB. There's a lot of misunderstanding of whether drones can actually have ADSB out or not. The first one is they can, right? 91225 actually allowed you to have ADSB out. HAI is working on an exemption for federal firefighting, because in certain areas where you don't have controlled airspace, you don't have air traffic control, you can actually use ADSB from drones to for situational awareness for the firefighting within a TFR, and it makes perfect sense. But when we talk ADSB out is mandated to be a very high power signal. And a lot of the issues that were related to air traffic control being blinded out was the idea that you would have all these systems that are transmitting a 70 nautical mile signal from the ground. And one of the solutions and things that is frequently discussed, in fact, I had the opportunity to discuss this with the FAA at the Part 108 listening session, is the idea of tabs, which are basically a slower power transponder beacon, or transponder assistance beacon, or traffic advisory beacon rather, that is an ADSB waveform. So it's the same signal, but it's like 0.1 watt, so that it only goes out about 7, 8, 9 nautical miles. It doesn't saturate everything, but it does allow for drones to use ADSB in the method it's used for. What compounds this, and one of the common misconceptions we run into, is the idea that you can either use ADSB to comply with remote ID, and there's actually a couple of waivers that are in place and exemptions that we're requesting that, or that remote ID gave you the same access as ADSB and that other people could receive it. And that's a common misconception, because unless you have a ADSB or a remote ID in receiver on board an aircraft, and you're willing to look inside your cockpit, your flight deck, when you're below 500 feet, it's not really going to do you any good. And anybody who's flown helicopters in low altitude, sub 300, sub 200, close terrain, landing on rooftops and doing that stuff, the last thing you want to do is stop looking outside and look in at a screen and try to track some of that. So we do have some of these solutions that are potential. So I would ask, to help cure up some of this misconception about whether ADSB is going to block everything out, is that yes, as published, ADSB would be a giant problem for air traffic control. But as we're all responding to these comments and requests for comments from the FAA about detect and avoid using ADSB, remind them that a low power solution like tabs would be very useful in this if they would just authorize it. Because then we could have things like, most people don't know there is a transponder code for lost link for drones. And what a great idea that you have a low power beacon that only turns on when you go lost link, so that other aircraft would actually have the aviation safety wherewithal to know, stay away from this lost link drone and what it's doing, and be able to track where it's going to. And those type of things that are actually a solution. So this is a misconception that's going to block everything out and shut down the ADSB network. But there are possible solutions, potential solutions that we can go for. So I'm going to take a deep breath now. Jonathan, you have any comments you want to add to that? Corrections, errata, counterpoints?
I think it needs to. I think it needs to be reassess that prohibition, because there are drone pilots. There's numerous ones. I mean, I work with a lot of 137 operators that are drone operators that would love to ADSB out in certain areas because they're operating around other manned 137 ops or helicopters, and they would love to let them know where they are. And so that, because their primary concern is like, well, whose fault is it? I mean, and from a regulatory standpoint, a drone operator could say, I'm not regulatorily even allowed to notify you. There's a safety benefit. I can't even let you know because I'm really prohibited from, doing this. So that's one real important point there. The assumptions of the total number of aircraft need to be reassessed again, because when the FAA and the final rule remote ID put out their numbers, the economic actually really in 2019 in December, when they put out the actual NPRM, it was based upon the economic numbers at that time, which for this year they were projecting total number of registrations to be at 1.25. Can you hear me? Are you there? Hello?
Yeah, we got you, Jonathan.
Okay, so I don't know, it just all just blocked out. But so the economic impact analysis that was done was estimating in 2023 that there was going to be 1.29 million, so about 1 point, I think it was like 3 or 1.5 million drones. When in reality, where are we at right now? We're at about 800-something-thousand. So the FAA, due to that, has kind of massively overshot that. And then they had these higher numbers where with the watt output, they don't really need high numbers. And if you look at the MITRE report that the FAA looked at, the MITRE report explicitly says that if you actually reduce some of these things, that you can actually have greater population densities and stuff. So a 0.01 watt output would be excellent for having drone operators to be able to kind of give everybody, the heads up that they're there, so we can try to prevent a mid-air collision.
Right. And again, apologize for dropping out, but I got to hear you most of the time. And I think that's kind of the piece, is that remote ID was designed for public safety concerns, and why the counter UAS and that threat issue is. ADSB was designed for traffic management and confliction, and we can't conflate the two, but there has to be a third option for this. So really happy there. And let's see here.
Wait, other point
Right.
regarding ADSB out, it doesn't broadcast the ground controller location. So the whole idea is that you got to capture the bad guy with the ground controller. ADSB out would just show the drone. So yeah, great, you stop the drone, but you don't know where the bad guy is. While remote ID, assuming the guy complies and hasn't disabled his aircraft or anything, and that way you would be able to find his ground controller and then be able to kind of stop that on the ground.
Right, but that's not an aviation safety issue. Where you on the ground isn't the aviation safety issue. Where you are as the controller is. Right, that's or not as a controller. Where your aircraft is, that's the aviation safety, because that's what's going to run into something. The ground itself isn't, unless you lose communications or otherwise. And that's part of the swap out, right, between aviation safety and national security and those type of measures.
Right.
So let's jump to, I think the last question, because I want to make sure we have time for Q&A. And I'm going to combine the last two, which is really basically the idea that there's a perception that manned aircraft are safer, and can drones replace manned aircraft? I think we can kind of put those together in a couple of different ways. So I'll start with what statistics or data supports or challenges the notion that manned aircraft are inherently safer than drones?
The NTSB database. So NTSB database really kind of gives you some clarity as to, I would say, a lot of things there, because in some regards, drones are going to be safer because there's no crew on board, right? So the NTSB database of the fatalities would argue kind of heavily in the favor of drones in certain types of instances regarding the crew members. Now, when you look at it from a risk standpoint of a drone that is from somewhere in China that has maybe, we don't even know what type of manufacturing capability, and quality control, we don't know how great it is, maybe no redundancies, from it being kind of in relationship to third parties is going to be greater of a risk than a manned aircraft. So kind of you have to break that apart, like whose risk are we dealing with right here? Because whenever you conflate it all and talk about total risk, then we kind of miss out on the bigger proportion of the discussion here, is that drones are tools in our tool belt to at certain times we might want to use them to completely just get rid of risk and eliminate it altogether for our ops. And at certain other times, we would be like, dude, that drone would be dangerous in this operation. We want to use a manned aircraft operation, in this situation, because the risk is different at different times.
Right, and I think that's part of the discussion, is that we focus in on the drone industry about removing the crew risk. And at the same time, we talk about, hey, the crew risk is different. But when you talk about things like shielded operations, where you're flying very close to critical infrastructure, you now have an increase of property risk and ground risk. When you talk about the lack of quality control, just like you said, one of the things that makes traditional aircraft safe is they get type certified. They have every piece of equipment, to include the lights, have to go through some type of technical standard order. And we don't have that with drones. We only have 2, right? Or maybe 3 that are type certified. And everything else is on your own and on your ability. And that, I think we downplay that risk a lot, truly, because there is something to be said for the rigid prescriptive production and manufacturing requirements and that quality assurance that you talk about that keeps traditional aircraft safe, that isn't there for drones. And again, I think that's the key piece. The operational piece I know is important. So we have the equipment side, and that is procedural. But I know there's a lot of misunderstanding on both sides about what type of safety protocols or redundancies are in there. And I think this is probably should be our last you and I question, just in the interest of time, to get the next one back out to the. I see a chat bubble or two. So, what are your thoughts procedurally on protocols?
On protocols for in what regards?
Well, the comparison between traditional manned aircraft and drones, who has better protocols and who, because again, there's a lot of thoughts, right? Is it the wild west for the drone guy? Is it the wild west for the traditional guy? How does that balance out?
Yeah, great question. So I think when everybody talks about these things in very broad strokes, it doesn't make any sense. There's typically multiple aspects to this. So for a lot of my Part 40, the clients that I have that are operating Part 47 type of drones that are 55 pounds and heavier, that are doing under 137 stuff, a lot of them, they all have SMS manuals. But you look at the 137 manned guys, not too many of them have it. So there's a weird situation where the aircraft is kind of sketchy. We don't know how great it is. So they make up for it with all sorts of documentation. So the clients have training manuals, operations manuals, safety management systems manuals, everything's documented. So you go to manned world, it's like, where's all your paperwork? And it's kind of like shocking. You're like, where's your paperwork, man? Okay, so that's one interesting, comparison. You get over into commercial ops of like 107 type of operators that have waivers and exemptions and authorizations, the kind of exotic stuff. A lot of those, they all have to have manuals, training manuals, as well as operations manuals. And that's probably on par, I would say, right? And we're probably less than like a 133, 130, especially a 135er, right? And so, but they're kind of getting up there and they have a lot of documentation requirements. When you get over into a general 107 guy, those are probably going to be probably inferior to your general Part 91 or really any of the operators. And then you get into the recreational guys. Pretty much every manned recreational guy, at probably like 95%, right, is going to be better than the recreational drone guy. That's probably, so it depends on which one you're comparing, because we're dealing with different things here.
Well, I like closing out on this one because it kind of loops us back to that responsible person. Is that everything you described for a traditional operator or a drone carrier, drone operator, the manuals, the protocols, procedures, somebody has to enforce that, right? Somebody has to make sure that you didn't just submit it to the FAA and put it on the shelf, right? That it's actually been worked. That's the whole idea behind ramp checks for the FAA. It's the idea behind the safety team. Those are the type of things that your OSDs, your operational suitability demonstrations, show. And I think the ease on a lot of this, and we call it, automation complacency in the human factors world, is that if your drones are automated, you don't need to worry about some of the procedures and policies, because the drones will do it for you. And that's not necessarily the case. So I like this because it kind of ties back into the idea that the responsible person is so key to all of this, because they need to do their job and make sure everybody's following the rules from there. So thanks so much for this piece. And I know you and I can have this conversation for about 3 more hours, given the chance, because I think we've done that once or twice before. Dan, do you want to open that up for questions and answers?
Sure. As of right now, we've only got one question, but I think you guys answered it pretty well too. Now, I've got a couple that I also came up with, but let's talk about Olivia's question first. She says, can you talk about the drone/manned aircraft deconfliction? Aside from the see and avoid, which may be impractical, how do we mitigate accidents? And then she says, do drones have ADS-B? Which
so I love this. So can I get you to put up the slide for Q&A?
Sure. Let me bring that deck back up.
and the only reason I laugh about this is my other favorite picture that I always like to bring up, because it does sort of address this in a way that is not aviation focused, but something everybody can kind of wrap their head around.
And it's
that
taking me just a second to get to it.
No problem. So part of that gets into the question of, how does the deconfliction start out with, right? And we're very used to using eyeballs and other things in traditional aircraft, and relying heavily on the pilot. So, my favorite example is the fact that there are horse-drawn buggies that have to have brake lights and traffic lights and turn lights in order to drive on the roads, right? And sometimes you're not sure which one you are. Is the drone the traffic buggy, or is the drone the high-speed car going next to it? But the reality is everybody needs some type of common means of conspicuity. ADSB was supposed to be that for all aircraft. It is not, right? So we don't have that solution, which is why we talk about the tabs. There are options out there related to lights, but a lot of the light information, position lights and anti-collision lights, again, because drones don't have the TSO, I can manufacture something, and not me personally, but a manufacturer can say that my 12-volt light has a 5 statute mile visibility and not have to prove it to anybody. And then there was actually a time where I did a bunch of tests of some really top-notch manufacturers that were being pushed as a rage, and not a one of them got past a mile and a half, a statute mile and a half. And we tested on a 10-mile flat, 0.1% grade road that was straight. It was used in the film Cannonball Run, so if you're familiar with that line. And we ran them all out at night, and not a one was visible by any means after a mile and a half. It just faded in. So when you talk about, the red and green lights and things like that we're used to in traditional aviation, when you have those 6 inches together, even 2 feet, apart, it doesn't mean anything anymore. Your eyes can't pick up what that means. So that deconfliction is very difficult. Added to the fact that drone remote pilots in the United States can't use radios, and aviation freaks, that a lot of the coordination is done over cell phone. And if you've flown recently in a traditional aircraft, there's not a lot of cell phone usage by the pilots and the flight crew. So that is a great challenge about that confliction, because all the normal methods we have aren't in play. Now there's some solutions out there about, is UAS traffic management, and there's some manufacturers who'd love to see the cell phone apps go there. But we don't really have a good answer for that. And that's one of the issues that HAI has brought up and championed. Jonathan?
Just out of curiosity, if I can jump in real quick, along the same lines, again, I'm going to show my ignorance here because I don't know anything about the industry. You were talking about the red and green lights, which would indicate night flights. Are there technologies available for night vision goggle operations that would permit you to see something from a further range on a drone?
Yes, I mean, that's been in place for 20 years. I did multiple flights flying small UAS in the military that way. It was easy. We just put a line light on it and away you go. The challenge there is that is not something, one, that's not something we're used to. And two, if I put only night vision goggle beacons, it's only visible by night vision goggle folks, right? Again, and frankly, if you're flying out there, you're probably better off with a red light, because that doesn't aid the remote pilot. And I know Jonathan's going to jump on this one because I didn't say it immediately. There's this whole goofy thing in part 107 about it has to be unaided vision, and night vision goggles are aided vision. So a lot of the things that would allow you to keep visibility, if you can't see with the naked eye or only corrective lenses, that's a violation of the regulation. Jonathan?
No, that's a great point. I mean,
So Dan, you had a couple others, and then I can hand it back to you and give everybody some time.
Yeah, I listened to the discussion about the different regulations we have in place here in the U.S., and it brought up a couple of questions in my mind. How do the U.S. regulations for drone operations compare with what's going on around the world? Are we more restrictive, less restrictive? Is there a balance among the different regulations around?
Well, my favorite piece of that is, and I have to thank the LinkedIn for it, is that I was reminded that 5 years ago, I had 2 of my corporate pilots that I sent to South Africa who got certified for beyond visual line of sight with a remote pilot instructor license by the Civil Aviation Authority of South Africa. So we can't do that in the US right now. But 5 years ago, we were able to do that in South Africa. Australia has a beyond visual line of sight piece for how you do remote pilot certification, how you do certification aircraft. EASA and EUROCAE are all developing and really pushing forward these rules. Transport Canada is really pushing forward these rules. The FAA recently, and I say recently, but probably about 3 years ago, made a decision to do things a little differently. So they separated the system back into its component parts. And even in the listening session recently, they talked about how they don't want to do a remote pilot certificate anymore. for beyond visual line of sight, that they would rather just do it through an operator and let it be operational requirement instead of an FAA requirement, and some of those type of things. So we're really doing things differently in the U.S. than around the world, and that draws a challenge for those of us who try to cross boundaries and borders and chase down reciprocity. Jonathan.
Is there, oh, please, Jonathan, go ahead.
I was just going to be, it depends on which country versus another country, depending upon what. They're all over the place. I can find another one that's better than us, and I can find another one where we're better than them. So
yes, that is also correct. That is all correct. There are plenty of countries who are like, whatever.
How does the UAS usage compare, say, within the US? Are we using more, or are there other countries that are kind of leading this challenge, leading this charge to do drone deliveries or do remote deliveries, say maybe in Africa or someplace like that?
Well, I mean, that is definitely the case, right? Africa and the African subcontinent really had a push back in 2014, pre-Zipline, right? The precursor to that was an idea called Red Line, Blue Line, which was entirely about taking advantage of the fact there was no transportation infrastructure. So the countries that have a very undeveloped transportation infrastructure have definitely leaped ahead to accepting this, right? If it takes 5 hours by donkey, right, and that's what it was in Kenya in 2014, it would take 5 hours by donkey just to get somewhere, or 35 minutes by drone. They needed a flying donkey. And you start looking at what that does and how that empowers the organization, how that empowers communities. If I can get my food that I grow to a location in half an hour, have it sold and bring back the supplies I need, and do that in 5 hours, I could have left my village that morning and still not arrived by the time everything was done. So there's a lot of growth there. The medical aspect of it, the vaccines and that type of thing. When you're moving temperature controlled vaccines, all that really applies. When you're dealing with archipelagos where it's all water based, really truly applies. And some of the denser environments. So again, it really depends on where they are and how open they are to some of the technology, and some of it's political. I mean, the bright side is that companies like Zipline, Wing, and Amazon and others, right, DDC, and they are all pushing very heavily in their countries of interest to get drone delivery to happen and make that work. But I think we're still a far cry from that being commonplace. And the reality is that a lot of those places don't have the traditional traffic that we do here. So it allows you to do things you couldn't do in the US anyway. Jonathan?
nothing to add.
Back to the regulatory issues again. Are there still any significant regulatory issues facing groups like the FAA to really make things move forward for drone operations?
I'll let you go first.
I mean, you have the NPRM that the FAA is working on presently on beyond line of sight, the FAA is trying to do, but mixed into that, you have the other issue of over people. So operations over people under 107.39 are restricted from being done. You have all these cars, people out on the road. So when you're flying beyond line of sight, you have the aspect of how do you maintain compliance with the regulations that prohibit you from doing those type of over people ops, right? You can't. So you have to have an aircraft that can fly over people, and that's another aspect. So they're trying to, there's the integration of that going on, as well as the FAA looking at that. There really only has been one means of compliance accepted from, I think, Virginia Tech, and one aircraft that has even been granted that, and that's the EBX, right? And so you have everybody else basically using 107.39 waivers to go about doing it. So there's this aspect here where the FAA is saying, hey, we're trying to figure out how to integrate you guys into the national airspace. And they're figuring it out right now with the 44.07 process and the type cert process, where they're like, hey guys, let's come on over here, let's do some type certs. And a lot of the companies went over there, and we only ended up with, I think, a total of 4 type certs. That there were 2 restricted category, and then I had 2 2117B ones that were done. And a lot of the companies bowed out because they either ran out of cash and they didn't realize how long it would take. Like that, I pulled a bunch of data on 2117 BTC. I love data, by the way. I love Excel. And so I was finding out like a lot of the TCs were taking about 500 to about 2,000 days. That was the range. And the average is about 1,000 to 1,500 calendar days. So that tells you got to like payroll those guys to build this stuff. So some FAA guy sits around. Well, lo and behold, a lot of these drone companies are going out of business, and they're like, yeah, we're not going to play with you. Why would I want to sell or try to come up with some US type cert for an aircraft that is 1,000 days old, when I can just sell a bunch of uncertificated stuff all over the place, especially overseas in Africa? And so the FAA kind of thought there would be a demand, like, hey, if you build it, they will come. And what they ended up finding is no one came to the baseball game, and well, some did, but a lot of them aren't coming there anymore because they realize, wow, that was an incredible waste of resources. So the FAA is kind of wrapping their head around this interesting aspect of how do you mitigate risk? Are you mitigating it with a really, really reliable air system that has been verified, or are you having a certain amount of operational restrictions? And then there's like this middle of the ground hybrid realm. They're kind of rethinking that. So that's a whole nother aspect, the economic aspect, because you can build it and the industry is like, I'm not going to pay for that. And then even if they did build it, who's going to pay for that thing when you can, especially the FAA, they've not gone after people and really heavily fined them. There's a article coming out here soon that kind of that I was working on that kind of reports that, and you start realizing the amount of the cost to comply is so astronomically high in some regards that it's, from an economic standpoint, is cheaper to just get popped. They did not disincentivize illegal ops. That's a whole. This is the economic. Right. What you're bringing.
I was going to say.
So.
I know we've had a lot of that discussion. There is some rulemaking that has to occur, and there is something also coming out from HEI to our members about the Beyond Visual Line of Sight rule listening session that Chris Martino and I just went to with the FAA, where we discussed a lot of these issues, and that gets into the FAA's approach and some of the things that Jonathan's saying, where they're looking at alternatives to type certification and things that make some more sense. I think the other thing that's really important as a factor, and maybe not necessarily on the near vision, but on the longer vision, the overarching view, is what's happening with automotive automation right now. So most of the same claims about human error versus robot error and safety of systems and safety of autonomy were made by the automotive autonomy folks, and it is gloriously self-destructing right now in a very huge manner because they scaled really, really quickly. And it's funny because you hear the arguments about regulated industry and how this is gonna matter, and this actually has impact with eVTOLs as well, right? This idea that it's so highly regulated on highways, and aircraft are less regulated, so it's easier for them to fly automated, and vice versa. That no, aviation is much more highly regulated than automotive, so it's going to be much easier for us to do, and a lot of those things that get in place. And the problem is that, much like how the cloud isn't really the cloud, it's just somebody else's computer, right? So you're just taking your problems with your computer and putting it on another computer. A lot of the human error issues you're taking away from a pilot, but you're sticking on to a software designer and the person responsible for the neural net and the machine learning aspects, and they're going to make mistakes too, and we don't really understand what kind of mistakes they're going to make, right? At the end of the day, automation has no common sense, so it can't just make a decision on something, and yet we're really pushing forward a lot of these systems with an aspirational safety rate, and we're promising they're safer with no real data. I also love data, which is why Jonathan and I talk as much as we do. Is that, I love getting reams of data together and just kind of hammering out and seeing what falls through, because at the end of the day, you start looking at that a lot of this information doesn't hold up when you look at the data, and it's truly based on marketing and on both sides, whether it's traditional or untraditional and new emergence, and that's the stuff we have to look at. So the regulations, unfortunately, we're doing everything by exemption, and exemptions aren't regulations. They're not repeatable. It's not predictable. It's depending on how things got through that week and other pressures that I think we really need to work through and focus. So,
well, I think
that would be my. I was gonna say that's my final thought on that is that the work there. So I think I just signed up for more work, huh?
Well, I think you just answered the question we got in from Nick. We'll close on this one because we're getting close to running over the top of the hour. We can sneak over a little bit. Nick was saying, can you speak to the viability and safety of VTOL air mobility? There's many startups in this space, and I think you were starting to kind of addressed that a little bit there, Jonathan.
Well, it is,
Yeah.
and I've said, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well,
There's
no,
two
no,
of us.
just no, it was JR JD, right? And so the 2117B type search, typically 500 to 2000 calendar days, average was around 1000 to 1500 calendar days. So you got to payroll enough people in order to kind of get to that to get a TC, to then, assuming you also have a production certificate, right? And you were producing the aircraft and they were having airworthiness certificates. You're looking at a fairly long time frame. You're going to need to you're holding your breath while running not a sprint, but more of like a 1000-day marathon, 1500 calendar day marathon. That's the economic viability kind of concept.
Right. And tying that same line, again, the same marketing request, the same lack of performance data. We don't have a lot of performance data on eVTOLs. There's very few aircraft. I mean, we just started seeing aircraft flying now in non-purely test canned environment. I think WISC was doing it Long Beach like a week ago, and it was a very big deal because they're actually flying in the national airspace and getting that flight time. But even that was a very, very restricted, very constrained operation. We just don't know what these aircraft can do. We've looked at that with vertiports. We've looked at that with everything else. And when you start getting into the automation, this is where things get difficult, because if you program out and design out the human's intervention, then the model starts to fail. Because if the human pilot in command can't actually influence the flight, then the liability, not product liability, but the negligence liability, the why things made a bad decision and everything went sour, gets transferred off of the pilot to somebody else. And our laws and regulations don't know how to handle that yet. So I'm waiting, and there's a very famous system where the pilot in command hits the button to take off, and that's the only input they do. They don't plan the flight, they don't control the flight, they don't terminate the flight. They just hit a button to take off. And I'm waiting for the first incident to go to court where that person goes, hey, all I did was took off. I couldn't make any changes, and see how that translates through.
Okay, well, hey, gentlemen, I appreciate your time. I'm going to share this last slide that you provided. You guys are both being very generous in providing an email address where if people, viewers do want to contact you to get more information, to get a question that they didn't necessarily want to answer or ask on air, this gives them an opportunity. So I'm going to leave this up for a second while people can grab their phones, grab a pencil, get a screenshot, do an alt print screen, something like that. But in the meantime, JR, JD, I should have done that from the very beginning. Thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us. This has been very, very, very informative, and I really do appreciate it.
That's great, Dan. Thank you.
I'm going to stop sharing and get my own slide deck back up because I do have some housekeeping things to go into. But gentlemen, thank you for spending time with us today. I found it fascinating as always. So do appreciate it.
Got it. Well, thank you very much. And we'll go ahead and sign off and hand it back to you.
Okay, thanks so much. My slide deck's back up here. Go. Sorry about this. We were using a couple decks here to make sure that we got all the information to everybody. So just need to hit the right buttons again. And that's weird, but okay, we'll just do it this way. Hey, we do have more webinars coming up. A couple of them are really interesting. The first one in November, November 9th. Normally our webinars are the second and fourth Thursdays every month. We have a webinar on rotorcraft wake turbulence. This has been a presentation that quite a number of people have been talking about lately. It's an issue that we want to make sure that everybody understands. It's a safety issue. We want to make sure that all of our pilots and operators are flying safely around other aircraft, and that other aircraft are flying safely around you as well. So I've seen this a couple different times at a couple different places, a couple different iterations, and I think you're going to enjoy it. We finally have a date for the NASA Mars helicopter. We have one of the people from JPL who will be joining us. It's going to be a very brief webinar, and it's going to be on a different date. So please pay attention. This is going to be on November 16th. Normally we would be the 24th, I think it is, in their 25th, that's or 23rd. That's going to be Thanksgiving here in the United States. It's a national holiday. Everybody's going to be eating too much, and we're not going to have a webinar. So we're going to back the webinar up a week on November 16th. In my conversations with NASA JPL on this webinar, what we've asked them to do is they had built the NASA Mars helicopter for 5 missions. And right now we are just, I think, at over 60 missions. They're now starting to fly further, higher, longer. They've accomplished everything else. So now they're kind of stretching the limits of what the NASA Mars helicopter can do. What are they learning from that? How will this affect future flights of aircraft on other planets, Mars, or how will it affect flight here on the on Earth? It's going to be interesting. It's going to be intense. It's going to be fast because we're only getting 30 minutes of their time. When you're talking to literally rocket scientists, aeronautical scientists, time is money, and they're giving us what they can. So I look forward to that one. HAI loves to share information. The webinars are one way we do it. Rotor Magazine is another way. Rotor Daily is another way. Rotor Magazine is an award-winning publication that's free unless you're outside the United States, and we have a small stipend. Rotor Daily is a daily news aggregator. It comes out every business day. We've done all the Google searches, so you don't have to. We will send you all the Rotorcraft news right to your inbox every single business day. All you need to do to subscribe to either one, go to rotor.org/subscribe, and you can sign up for one or both right there. We do appreciate feedback. There may be a survey coming out to you. We do appreciate it if you'd spend a few minutes, particularly if you have ideas for topics for future webinars. If you have information for HAI in general, questions, how we could improve things, how we can do better, we always want to know that too. We're a membership-based organization, and so it's important that we're meeting the needs of our members. Easiest way to pass this information along is through an email to Jim Viola, our president and CEO. Very simple email address, president@rotor.org. Send him a few lines to let him know what you're thinking. If it's something he can address, he will. If it's something that's more in depth and needs a subject matter expert, it's either on staff or so we'll find one to help you with the issue. That does wrap things up for us for today. We do appreciate JD and JR joining us this afternoon to discuss the misconceptions on drones and how things are going to be advancing in the future. I thought it was a great one. Really enjoyed listening to the two of them. But that does bring us to the end. And so until our next webinar in November, we ask that you be safe and you fly safe, and we'll see you very, very soon.